If you thought you knew CKD, chronic kidney disease, it changed in 2021. So for the first time in a long time, there have been adjustments to CKD, chronic kidney disease, as far as how we classify it. So in this episode of the Paul Chandler Show, and hi y'all, I'm your host, Paul Chandler, we'll be looking at the new way how we code CKD, chronic kidney disease, with ICD-10-CM. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. So in this episode, we're going to be coding CKD, or chronic kidney disease, in 2021 because we finally have had some changes. As normally CKD for N18, that category has been the same for quite a while. But as you can see here, the stage 3 or moderate CKD for N18.3 had some revisions with some new codes for this year. So we still have N18.1 as stage 1, N18.2 is stage 2 or mild CKD. Skipping N18.3, I'll come back to that in a moment. But then N18.4 is still stage 4 or severe CKD, and stage 5 chronic kidney disease is still N18.5, and ESRD or end-stage renal disease is still the good old N18.6. And CKD unspecified stage is still N18.9. The difference, though, is the stage 3 or moderate CKD. So instead of just having the N18.3 code, now we have N18.30, 0.31, and 0.32. So like I said, this is an update in the code set, getting more specification to stage 3, since the GFR numbers, and that we'll cover in a moment as well if you're not familiar with that. But for stage 3, it split the long range of the GFR scale. So we have now N18.30 for CKD stage 3 unspecified, meaning you know it's stage 3, you know it's in that range, but you do not know if it is stage 3A or stage 3B. The new stage 3A is code N18.31, and our new stage 3B, as in Bravo, is N18.32. So before we go over the different stages and the GFR levels, we're going to look at the ICD-10 guidelines first. So here we have guideline 1C9A2 for hypertensive chronic kidney disease. So if a patient has hypertension and chronic kidney disease, then we assign a code in the category I-12 for hypertensive chronic kidney disease, and a second code, a use additional code, in the N18 category to specify what stage of CKD the patient has. So if you were to look at the I-12 codes, we said that they're in ranges. Stages 1 through 4 or unspecified, and stage 5 or end-stage renal disease. So with those type of aspects, that's what I call the codes as I got a secret, I ain't gonna tell you. Meaning if you choose your code in I-12, you know generically what part of the GFR scale the patient's in, but you still have that gap of stage 1 through 4 or unspecified in one group code set in I-12, and then stage 5 or ESRD in a second code set. That's why we need to have both codes, the I-12 reflecting the hypertension aspect of it, and the N18 to specifically state what stage of CKD the patient has. Now, something to note though, if you look at the first bullet point, the paragraph, the last sentence that says CKD should not be coded as hypertensive if the provider indicates CKD is not related to the hypertension. So that where it comes back into documentation for us as coders or auditors to see if there's that correlation that the provider makes. So then, like I mentioned earlier though, the I-12 would go first, and then the N18 code would go second. And then looking at the second from the bottom bullet, if a patient has hypertensive chronic kidney disease and acute renal failure, the acute renal failure should also be coded. So in that case, you'd have an I-12, an N18, and the appropriate code for the acute renal failure. And of course, no matter if the patient is outpatient or inpatient, always remember to sequence the codes based on the circumstances of the admission, for example, to the hospital or the encounter, say if you're at the outpatient doctor's office visit. So that's the guidelines 1C9A2 for hypertensive CKD. But the patient can have the combo hypertensive heart and CKD disease. So that brings us to ICD-10-CM guideline 1C9A3. So if a patient has hypertensive CKD and acute renal failure, we also code the acute renal failure because now we are in the I-13 category. So while we had the I-12 for just hypertensive CKD, if they have the combo heart and CKD hypertension, then we change the category to I-13. If the patient has heart failure, then we need to have 3 codes. So we'd always have I-13 first for hypertensive heart and CKD. If the patient has heart failure, then we would add a code from category I-50 to specify specifically what stage or what type of heart failure the patient has. And then we still need the N18 code for what stage specifically the patient has for CKD. Because just like how we had an I-12 for hypertensive CKD, here in I-13, hypertension, heart, and CKD, we're coding the first code, the I-13. That's still the I got a secret and I ain't gonna tell you what stage of CKD the patient has. So then we need the appropriate N18 code. So when we have the issue of hypertensive, heart, and CKD, we'll need 2 codes if there's no heart failure. We'll have a code in the I-13 category for the hypertension, heart, and CKD, and a code in the category N18 for the CKD stage. However, though, if the patient has hypertensive, heart, and CKD with heart failure, then we need 3 codes. A code in category I-13 reflecting the hypertension, the second code in the I-50 category reflecting what type of heart failure the patient's having, and a third code in N18 to specify what stage of CKD the patient has. Now here's an oh so awesome chart grid that you can use in helping you coding hypertension involving also the heart and CKD. So going from the top to the bottom, patient has hypertension, HTN. Then you check to see is there heart disease involved or CKD involved, yes or no. And simply just following the lines basing on the questions of yes or no. And if you'd like, you can pause this episode after it's the live first time and check to see if this makes sense and make notes in your coding book if you'd like. Now we do have a couple more guidelines to go over. We have in 1C14A1, stages of CKD. And I'm just going to highlight this for a moment because in a few moments I'm going to show you a grid that gets specific as far as what GFR number, and that's just simply a rating scale, equates to what stage of CKD. However, though, in this documentation, then it provides the fact that there are the N18.1, 0.2, 0.30, 0.31, 0.32, 0.4, 0.5, and 0.6. A note at the bottom, though, as far as the last bullet point on this part, if both the stage of CKD and ERCD, end-stage renal disease, are documented, assign code N18.6 only. Now, the thing is, though, if a patient has CKD and so that chronic kidney disease, if the patient has had a transplanted kidney, meaning that the two kidneys or one, depending on the situation, that has a chronic kidney disease is not what I call the Lady Gaga version, as in, born this way, and you really do not want me to sing, so I'll stop. But if the patient has CKD going on, we still do all the appropriate codes. However, though, we would have to tack on at the end code Z94.0, just letting the powers that be know that the complications that the patient is having regarding this kidney is for a transplanted kidney, not the one the patient was born with. And one last set of guidelines to look at, that a patient can have, unfortunately though, have CKD with other conditions. And notice how it states that patient with CKD may also suffer from other serious conditions, most commonly diabetes and hypertension. The sequencing of the CKD code in relationship to the codes for other contributing conditions is based on the conventions in the tabular list. So for example, going back to the first part, where we show the picture in your ICD-10 book, that if you notice above the code N18.1, it says code first, any associated diabetic CKD or hypertension CKD. Now here's a grid that can help us as far as coders. The GFR. So like I mentioned, the GFR is like a rating scale, because that percentage there tells you how much of your kidney is functioning normally. So with the separation in 2021 of stage 3 into stage 3A and 3B, so there we have stage 3A, mild to moderate. The GFR is 59 to 45, and 3B, 44 to 30. So we have the appropriate stages 1 through 5, and then the GFR. Because remember, ESRD, or end-stage renal disease, that is the equivalent of a patient being on chronic dialysis. So a patient can be technically any stage of CKD and on chronic dialysis. Usually at that point, you're going to be definitely a stage 5, maybe a stage 4. If you're at the low numbers of the GFR, maybe 15, 16, 17 kind of thing. But what I do recommend doing is look at your diagnosis book and see if by the codes they list the GFR number on there. Some publishers do and some publishers don't. That's the one thing though, as far as coders and auditors. If the provider, for example, says patient has a GFR of 43, but does not mention the phrase patient has moderate to severe CKD, or the patient does not have stage 3B CKD. But like I said though, if they have in the documentation, say 43% GFR or GFR of 43, then we can translate that GFR number to being stage 3B. So that we can code that in 2021 now as code N18.32. So that is how you code CKD and chronic kidney disease in 2021. And the major differences or just be the split of just having one code for stage 3 into 3 different options. Again, N18.30 for stage 3 unspecified, N18.31 for stage 3A, and N18.32 for stage 3B. And that wraps it up for this episode of the Paul Chandler Show. From all of the cast and crew here, we do thank you for watching and have an awesome rest of your night.